This episode is brought to you by Minus 33. For high-quality merino wool base layers, tops, gloves, socks, and more, go to minus33.com and use code 33backcountry15 at checkout to get 15% off your first order. Welcome to the Backcountry Podcast. I'm Adam Howard.
The red line is for spring skiing, Dostie yelled as we skinned up slope toward the rocks we'd hoped were there. This is not spring skiing.
This episode is a reading by my friend Matt Richardson of a piece I wrote in 2017 called Wingwalkers, about the legendary Redline Traverse. As you'll hear, if you don't know already, the Redline was a groundbreaking long-distance ski of California's High Sierra. From my early days at Backcountry Magazine, senior editor John Dostie would share stories of his time in Vermont and California with guiding legends Alan Bard and Tom Carter. The two had a mythical status among the pioneers of backcountry skiing on light, three-pin setups. And their slideshows, as well as their stories celebrating their exploits, were mainstays in Powder Magazine, Couloir, and Backcountry in the 80s and 90s. While I didn't have time in 2017 to attempt the whole Redline, I did have a window and a group of partners to help crack it open. But you gotta keep your hands off the sill in the Eastern Sierra, because that window will slam closed with a gust of wind. Our story is just an opening into the ski touring history of perhaps the most iconic and uncelebrated ranges in North America. If you like stories like this, shoot me a note, howie@backcountrymagazine.com, and we can do more of them. Enjoy.
There's a range in America's most populous state that's hemmed by desert and people. Millions each year collectively attempt to climb Mount Whitney, or ogle Yosemite's Half Dome, or ski at Mammoth, or hike the John Muir Trail. The summits here tower 10,000 feet above the Owens Valley to the east, and it's arguably on this granite and snow where both American ski mountaineering and long-distance ski touring were born. The mountain objectives and gear have changed a lot over the century since the first snow surveyors plotted these hills. But a few things haven't changed in California's eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. It's still breathtakingly high, it can get insanely deep in winters like last year's, and from October to May, there's no one here. The corn we'd hoped to be skiing was ripping our faces off. High on the western flank of Mount Keith, 13,976 feet, the sustained 60-mile-per-hour winds were not only clearing our pores, but also stripping the snow, the visibility, and our spirits. If we were to complete this small section of the famed Redline Traverse between Onion Valley and 14,494-foot Mount Whitney, we needed to get over Junction Pass and southward, down into our third camp near the base of Shepherd's Pass. We were a day behind already, and to turn around here would mean succumbing to the Eastern Sierra and abandoning our route. And there was another problem. The Hausdoerffer brothers, altitude fit from Crested Butte, Colorado, had been waiting up there, totally exposed, for nearly an hour, and John was losing it. He'd gone out hot and hard to catch his brother, Tyson, and as the two sat, the temperature plummeted right along with the ceiling. He was shivering uncontrollably when Craig Dostie and I arrived. "Is my face still attached?" I asked Haus, trying to elicit a laugh. Nothing. What to do? We all wedged ourselves around him behind a Volkswagen Beetle-sized boulder for an emergency warm-up. There wasn't a lot of heat to lend, either. "We need to find some bigger rocks," Dostie hollered into the incessant howling, knowing that, to find them, we'd need to go up to where he'd seen the contours tighten on the 15-minute quadrangle in the morning down at our second camp in Center Basin. With luck, and a windscreen, we could wait there for a weather window. While we'd hoped to gain more ground today, all we really had to do was drop a few thousand feet south to where we'd be geographically committed to completing the 6-day, 30-mile route, our calendar be damned. We'd envisioned sunbathing on Sierra granite and long, lazy lunches, 50-degree corn that skied like late-season powder, open alpine lakes and streams into which we could dip our bottles. We'd packed accordingly, floorless tents, 30-degree bags, and a ration of gas based on cooking with water, not melting snow at 11,000 feet. We got an unrelenting winter. We should have done more homework. Yet coming in June could have meant less snow, and less snow means more rock walk, or worse, rotten, dinosaur, and a tar pit post-holing. "The red line is for spring skiing," Dostie yelled as we skinned up slope toward the rocks we'd hoped were there. "This is not spring skiing." By all accounts, the winter of 2016-17 was the biggest since 1982 and 1983. In parts of the Sierra this past season, the snowpack neared 200% of average. It was so deep that a month to the day before we arrived, California Governor Jerry Brown officially lifted the state's emergency declaration after 5 years of drought conditions, which, at times, saw snow surveyors, the public utility contractors, and employees who keep track of forecasting winter runoff standing next to snow courses not on skis, but in sneakers. Over the course of 2 spring corn seasons following those fat, early 80s winters, Tom Carter, Chris Cox, and Alan Bard pieced together sections of what they called the Redline, chronicling the epic in Powder Magazine in February 1984, and bringing a national small S spotlight on the mountains John Muir dubbed the Range of Light for the first time in a generation, maybe 2. While a transparent red line apparent on most maps literally delineates the boundary between the John Muir Wilderness and Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Parks for the self-proclaimed fun hogs. It was less prescriptive and more immersive, and the story in Powder is more cryptic poetry than waypoint detail. Our route, Carter and Bard penned, closely followed the political boundary which indicates the very crest of the Sierra dividing its western and eastern watersheds. Hidden beneath the cartographer's transparent red line is a mind-boggling array of the Sierra's most magnificent peaks. The 3 and several others over the course of 2 seasons would begin south of Mount Langley, the Sierra's southmost 14,000-foot summit, and stay as high as possible, jogging back and forth across the line while skiing whatever weather, snow, and their balls allowed. 3 collective weeks and 200 miles later, they arrived at Mammoth and added to their status as backcountry legends. Carter, now 65, recalls those years with a mix for joy and pain, remembering his friend Bard, who died 20 years ago in 1997, while guiding on Wyoming's Grand Teton. According to Carter, who now lives in Cedar Flats near Lake Tahoe, it was the coming together of minds, fitness, and game-changing telemark gear that made their light and fast approach possible. It also grew out of local knowledge and years of doing it the hard way. Alan went on a number of expeditions with Ned Gillette, Carter remembers today. He had to come up with these ideas every year. Ned showed us that if you can write articles, you can go on trips. One of those trips in 1978 was around Ellesmere Island, the largest landmass north of the Arctic Circle and between Baffin Island and the northernmost part of Canada. Bard came back as strong as anyone could be on skis, Carter says. It looked like he had tennis balls under his skin in his triceps from pulling a sled. The following year, Bard, Gillette, and others completed the first circumnavigation of Denali, hauling sleds and giant packs. That was a huge trip, Carter recounts. No one had done it. You carried huge packs because there were technical aspects of the route, passes, glacial ice, whatever. Given the floppy cross-country touring equipment of the day, Bard and crew had to also pack more substantial mountaineering boots. It was insane. In 1980, Carter joined Gillette and Bard on a 33-day traverse from Mount Cook to Mount Hutt in New Zealand with only one cache. Typically, these epics were done between the Sierra's winter and summer guiding seasons when, again, these guys were carrying and ferrying heavy loads for Dave Beck's Sierra ski touring clients. You can't load a client like you can load a guide, Carter says. Whether it was on a multi-day Sierra Crest crossing or to build a base camp, Carter, Cox, Bard, and other guides would come off the season supremely strong. In the spring of 1982, and from their experience with large loads, they were over it. They wanted to fly. Luckily, they weren't the only ones making gains. Around 1981, Norwegian ski manufacturer Karhu changed everything with the XCD GT. It was cross-country lean, but with metal edges and a little less camber. Add to that the newest powerful Ace Solo Extreme 3-pin boots, and an idea was born. How fast can we go in the range of light? They weren't the first, they'll admit, to start banging out multi-day missions in the Eastern Sierra, nor were they the only ones doing it at the time. But they were doing it with astonishing speed, and the frequency made possible by being, frankly, unemployed in late spring each year. Lee Vining to Yosemite, Bishop to Florence Lake, across and down Bubbs Creek to Cedar Grove. Increasingly, the fast, objective-oriented approach was taking hold in the Sierra. That's the kind of stuff that was starting to appeal to people because it traverses the crest, Carter says. So, what we decided to do was no, that pack cannot weigh over 25 pounds. We were really good at packing, Carter continues. We take our terraplanes, make them as small and light as can be, and now you can be nimble. Now you can play with it. You've been guiding all year at 11,000 feet. You're in the best shape you can be, and everything is in the groove. Your mind and body are working in harmony, and you're kind of unstoppable. It's not a ski tour from one end to the other along the crest. It's a series of moves, Carter goes on. Let's go until we run out. Don't get him wrong, he cautions. Those mountains humbled he and his partners over and over again. And that was the part of it that we loved so much, he says. There's still stuff you don't know about them, and you're never going to learn it all, no matter how many lifetimes you spend in them. The only person in our group who'd spent any time in the Sierra was Dostie. In 1988, he founded the black and white Couloir magazine. As its name implied, the title mostly celebrated steep lines in Southern California at the time. Like a lot of his contemporaries, Dostie focused not on multi-day traverses, but single-day assaults on rowdy lines. From his home in Truckee, he also had the convenience of playing the weather, but not for this trip. Dostie now lives in Colorado, and we had a narrow window for success. And as we stumbled upon our bigger rocks, he felt that window closing. Below us, to the south, lay a 2,000-foot ramp that was wind-loading at an impossible rate. There's no way there's not a giant cornice all along the entire saddle, Tyson had yelled on the way to the rocks as we blindly linked arms to test the rollover. Even if we could see it, I don't think we could ski it today. So we waited. We set cutoff times. If it doesn't open up in 15, we're going down, we said. Then 15 minutes would come, and we'd reset the timer. And again, and again. Soon, we were fighting not just wind and visibility or hypothermia, but daylight. When I would later relate our plight to Carter, he'd laugh that this was like trying to surf a spot that's not breaking. He'd paddled out like that many, many times. He still does to this day. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, skiing in North America was, in large part, informed by what was happening, or had happened, farther up the Sierra Nevada in the Lost Range. Gold miners north of Lake Tahoe started using what were called snowshoes for travel, and there was not a lot of nuance in those early 10 and 12-foot long skis. According to Sierra ski pioneer, guide, and historian Doug Robinson, they were as useful in guarding claims as they were in getting from A to B, and miners knew the mountains held real pay dirt. The miners started going higher to find these things, says Robinson, 70. They quickly realized that if they left their claims during the winter, that their claims would have been jumped. By spring, when they get back and go, well, this is my claim, they'd be looking down the barrel of a gun. Soon, though, the skis became not just tools, but the means for passing time. Many of the miners, remember, were Scandinavian. Recreation turned to racing, and these claimers are known to have some have held the world's first ski races. Given the surrounding gold, wagering became commonplace, and the stakes were high. So high that secret waxing techniques were developed, and speeds in those early days topped 80 miles per hour. Down in the South Lake Tahoe area, John Snowshoe Thompson was skiing for a different purpose. From Genoa, California to Placerville, Nevada, he'd deliver mail, medicine, and other staples, the only link in winter between east and west. Born in Norway, Thompson is widely credited with popularizing what became the sport and culture of skiing in California and throughout the West. And, according to Robinson, he was a proponent of scientific skiing, whereby no wax would be used for advantage. It wasn't until 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad went in, that Thompson retired. All of this took place way farther north than we are today. Down in the Owens Valley, home to towns like Bishop, Big Pine, Independence, and Lone Pine, ranching served as the area's primary industry. The High Sierra held no gold, though the area had been mined for tungsten. So there's no record of much skiing happening here until around 1900, when the state, municipalities, and private companies employed the first hydrographers, snow surveyors, or stream gaugers to log the Sierra snowpack that would feed countless reservoirs in the foothills to power or hydrate California's multiplying masses. As much as 1/3 of California's water comes from the Sierra. And while some of the surveying is conducted through satellite imagery and remote electronic sensors, much still takes place on skis. Some of the courses still take up to 11 days to complete. That's a lot of skiing. And, as was the case with the Redline boys, as the surveyors worked in the mountains, ideas for multi-day adventures emerged. There's one road into Big Creek, California, but in 1919, the town was booming, home to one of the biggest, most expensive hydroelectric projects of its time. At nearly 5,000 feet, the town was headquarters to Southern California Edison's extensive dam project on the headwaters of the San Joaquin River, where half a dozen dams created power for Fresno County. California native Orlan Bartholomew moved there with his family at age 20 and began working for Edison as a stream gauger to help predict runoff. Early on, he tended to his courses on snowshoes, but soon discovered his work was much more efficient on skis. Edison decided that, no, skiing was too dangerous, Robinson says. But obviously, Bartholomew was a skier by then, and he was becoming addicted like we all do. So, under the eyes of his supervisors, he and his coworkers would simply snowshoe out of camp to where they'd have their skis stashed. After a failed mining stint in Alaska, Bartholomew moved back to Big Creek and returned to stream gauging. An experienced trapper, he'd earned a reputation not just as a hard man for going weeks on end in the mountains, but also as a bit of an intellectual, reading works of Thoreau, Muir, and other naturalists. He also photographed extensively while on the job. During the summer of 1928, Bartholomew and fellow gauger Ed Steen planned an ambitious winter traverse of the 210-mile John Muir Trail that stretches from Mount Whitney to Yosemite. Not unlike Bard and Carter in the early 80s, Bartholomew and Steen had more in mind than just skiing. They sought and obtained sponsorship for their adventure and planned to chronicle the experience through photographs, newspaper articles, and even motion picture. But shortly before the two were to depart, the San Joaquin Travel and Tourist Board pulled its $1,000 sponsorship of the trip, claiming that their board of directors felt that a winter expedition was unlikely to draw interest from tourists. With the news, Steen too pulled out. He couldn't afford to be unemployed all winter. So Bartholomew decided to go it alone. On Christmas Day, 1928, he left North Cottonwood Canyon on specially made skis that were 2 feet shorter and an inch wider than other skis of the day. His 70-pound pack carried cooking gear, clothes, a double-bitted axe, a 12-pound down robe, and a camera. His only support were the 11 food caches he and Steen had placed along the trail that summer by horseback. By today's standards, author and journalist Gene Rose ponders in retelling Bartholomew's adventure in his 1974 book, High Odyssey. Wintering in the Sierra before World War II was infinitely more severe. There were fewer roads across the Great Barrier, and none was plowed until 1943. For 5 or nearly 6 months a year, the high country was snowbound, with no search and rescue units, no saving helicopters. In 1928, there was only the winter with its cold and snow as it had been for thousands of years. Other adventures of the late 20s had captivated the imaginations of a generation. The well-supported expeditions of George Mallory and Charles Lindbergh's 1927 solo flight across the Atlantic were commercial and media sensations. If Bartholomew and Steen hadn't lost their funding, would their names be as hallowed today? He was a modest man, Rose said of Bartholomew, minimizing or downgrading his own accomplishment to the point of disbelief. In the end, and alone, Bartholomew spent 42 nights sleeping at higher than 10,000 feet. It took him 100 days to reach Yosemite Valley, arriving in April, and along the way, he completed the first winter ascent of Mount Whitney, where he picked up the Muir Trail and likely countless other firsts that were never recorded. Between 3 and 6 years after Bartholomew's feat, depending on which source you believe, German cross-country ski champion Otto Steiner skied from Giant Forest on the west side of the Sierra to Triple Divide Peak, then jagged south and west to Mount Whitney. It was a 10-day round trip and the first of many other feats and firsts in the Sierra that went largely unchronicled, save for a few scant mentions in the Sierra Club Bulletin. He was skiing on wooden cross-country skis, Robinson says, like old-school pin bindings, floppy boots. Obviously, he was a really good skier, and he was out there alone. It's pretty good ski mountaineering country, really. Not cross-country skiing, as we sort of know the word. While he's a local legend to the Sierra, says Dostie, who, like Robinson, interviewed Steiner before he passed away, it's a shame more of his accomplishments were never really celebrated during his lifetime. He was well known as a cross-country racer and as the coach of the UCLA ski team, but I think he was pretty bitter that he wasn't better known for his ski mountaineering. As climbing boomed in nearby Yosemite in the 1920s and early 30s, a new breed of mountaineers began learning that, mostly, you can only climb rock in the Sierra 6 months a year. If mountaineering was the freedom of the hills, Robinson suggests, then half of the year the hills are smothered in snow, and so the skis are your mountaineering tool. While he wasn't known as a skier himself, legendary Sierra climber Norman Clyde, who once considered joining Bartholomew on his journey, met a young David Brower. He suggested that, to complete his skill set as a mountaineer, Brower should join the Sierra Club's Ski Mountaineers section. He did, along with an astonishing group of future thought leaders in the environmental and political world. Brower himself would go on to be executive director of the Sierra Club and would found the League of Conservation Voters, Friends of the Earth, and the Earth Island Institute. Bester Robinson, who'd later serve as California governor and on the U.S. Supreme Court, also joined the Ski Mountaineers section. By the early 40s, armed with winter mountaineering skills from their time in the snowy Sierra, Brower and many of his contemporaries were hired by the federal government to instruct at Colorado's Camp Hale, the troop that was later called the 10th Mountain Division. And, in 1942, the Sierra Club published its Manual of Ski Mountaineering, which was largely based on the tools and techniques developed by Brower and Robinson, Alan Steck, Alex, Joel, and Milton Hildebrand, Murray Kirkwood, Einar Nilsson, and H. Stuart Kimball, M.D. While Brower's first ascents throughout the Sierra are widely chronicled, much less is documented about his skiing. And during the post-war 40s, 50s, and early 60s, the same can be said about ski touring in the Sierra, south of Mammoth, down to Big Creek. During these years, ski resorts began popping up around the United States, and the popular perception of the sport shifted away from adventure skiing and toward rope tows, PAMAs, and later, chairlifts. Yet snow surveyors were still tracking the Sierra. One of them was Dave McCoy, a highly skilled mountaineer in his own right, who from his deep knowledge of the terrain north of Bishop would go on to found Mammoth Mountain in 1953. With the opening of the resort, a new gravity began to pull young adventurers to the area. Not long after Mammoth opened, developers began plotting a resort in the Mineral King Basin through which Steiner had passed 3 decades earlier. Another early Sierra ski visionary is my old coach at UCLA, Otto Steiner, wrote the late ski industry pioneer Wolfgang Lert in 2007 for the 3rd issue of Skiing Heritage. In the early 1930s, he went on a solo ski exploration between Sequoia National Park and Mount Whitney and stumbled upon the limitless slopes of Mineral King. Steiner inspired Cordy Hill, Vic Hasher, Fay Lawrence, Willie Schaffler, and Walt Disney to draw up plans for Mineral King ski area. Disney had fallen for skiing and proposed a massive 27 chairlift resort. In its early phases, the Sierra Club supported the plan. As it grew to envision 2 million annual visitors, the club withdrew its support and, under executive director David Brower, went on to fight the project alongside with other environmental groups in court. Eventually, the project was halted and later, the basin was annexed into Sequoia National Park. As siting for the ski resort that would never be was under consideration, Disney hired a local guide to winter in the basin and observe avalanche paths. That winter in the Sierra inspired a young David Beck to retrace some of Steiner's route, but he set his sights higher. Skiing in from the eastern Owens Valley side, the opposite of what Steiner had done, Beck, Nick Hartzell, and Gary Kirk would ascend Shepherd Creek, only 2,000 feet below where our group was pinned down. Like with us, weather got in their way. That was 1969. It wasn't until April 1975 when Beck, Hartzell, and Bob Cooley would complete the Sierra High route. The best part of the trip, he'd tell my friend, Tahoe-based writer Brad Rassler for a story first published in Couloir in 1997, was skiing from the tablelands down the Marble Fork of the Kawe River and into the red firs and bluebirds of Sequoia National Park. It took the trio 5 days. Not long after he completed the high route, Beck pulled up stakes in Wolverton, where he operated Sequoia ski touring on the west side of the range for many years, and moved to Mammoth to found Sierra Ski Touring. Still mostly geared towards Nordic skiing, his new outfit began to attract top touring talent. Carter and Brad, who taught cross-country skiing at Vermont's Trapp Family Lodge, started working for Beck. Robinson, too, worked a stint for Beck. 5 years earlier, in 1970, a young Robinson and Carl Peanut McCoy, the Mammoth founder's fifth son, then recovering from a bad ski racing accident, decided to traverse the entire Muir Trail. Like Bartholomew, they had giant packs. With cross-country ski equipment of the day still underpowered, the two used fiberglass Hexel skis, Silvretta bindings, no skins, and a ton of Nordic clister and paste wax. I met Peanut when he was just out of plaster from his ski racing accident, Robinson says, and we very quickly got the idea of skiing the Muir Trail. But in the end, only about half of it was on the Muir Trail, and the other half was higher variations along the Sierra crest. So you can see, we began the transition toward the Redline. Twilight comes late to the Sierra in May, and at 13,000 feet, even in whiteout conditions, it really does feel like you're closer to the sun. But around 5 p.m., we were still locked out. So we decided to do what Beck and company did in 1969, not far from where we sat on Junction Pass. Our fallback wouldn't put us at the car, though, but at our second camp in Center Basin, just uphill from the John Muir Trail. If the weather improved, we'd move camp a little lower to get to some open water on Bubbs Creek and do day trips from there. It felt eerie returning to where we'd slept without any expectation to sleep there again. Fine, wind-sifted powder, not Sierra cement, covered our kitchen trench and sleeping platform. The visibility had improved, and as the sun dropped over the island in the basin called Center Peak, 12,736 feet, to our west, traces of light filtered through the giant white park and lodge pole pines surrounding camp. Above us to the east, freshly slid avalanche paths streaked the lower flanks of Mount Bradley, 13,264 feet, which lies smack dab on the Redline. That's reassuring, Tyson said as he dug, appreciating the discretion of our choice. I wondered, as we re-excavated, where the original Redline boys would have come on this part of their journey. They must have traveled near where we were stranded en route to Keith, and on to Bradley and the Center Basin crags just north of us. But their powder story didn't tell. With Bard gone and Carter and Cox logging thousands of days skiing and guiding since, it takes a lot of brain racking to get through to accurate memories of a line they skied over a couple of springs 35 years ago. Since the late 80s and early 90s, guiding big overnight traverses in the Sierra has been in steady decline. According to Robert S.P. Parker, longtime Sierra guide and founder of Sierra Mountain Center, SMC, there were several outfits and guides working the range during the Bard and Carter years in addition to their own alpine expeditions, AE, including Doug Robinson, Rock Creek Winter Lodge, RCL, Dave Beck's Sierra Ski Touring, John Fisher's Palisade School of Mountaineering, and Bella and Mimi Vadaz's Alpine Skills International. When I started SMC in the early 90s, we followed in their footsteps, Parker says. RCL was in decline and had changed ownership. AE imploded, and Bella was in Tahoe. No one else was really offering tours, and we drew upon our experiences and made a new business. But our ski tours fell off a cliff in the late 90s and went from 6 or 8 a spring to 1 or 2. Parker attributes the transition away from guiding and the historically popular kind of touring to 3 things: climate change, shifting demographics, and an over-regulated national park system. In the 80s and early 90s, the Sierra would be corn end to end, and you could ski anything, anywhere, he remembers. In the late 90s, cycles shifted away from freeze-thaw to thaw-thaw, and that is what we have now. The corn season is much shorter, and we end up just going in isothermal snow so much earlier. Or, as was our case, you get winter and spring. The growing interest in telemark skiing in the 90s didn't translate to more touring in the Sierra either. Roadside hike 2 shots and day touring grew in popularity, but going deeper didn't. Backcountry ski touring with an overnight pack is hard. You have to be able to ski and herd a little. People just do not want to do that anymore, Parker continues. Even though the gear has improved vastly from leather A solos through the Scarpa T3 to current AT equipment, people are more interested in the downhill experience. Look at Black Diamond advertising that says, "It's all about the down." In the Sierra, it's all about the across. It could be because of the gear and in spite of the unreliable weather that long-distance touring is now on the rebound here, and maybe the guiding will follow. While a Redline repeat hasn't been recorded since the original, it's happened twice over the past 2 years, and all on light, randonnée race-inspired gear. Quinn Hess and Sean Bunnell skied the route in 2016, and IFMGA guide Jed Porter skied it in 15 days just before we were there last spring. He saw 7 people. Porter, Hess, and Bunnell stuck as close to the line as snow would allow, but given the poor snowpack in 16 and the great snow last spring, their routes were, by their accounts to me, remarkably different. Tom Carter knows of another larger group led by Dave Pinkham, who did the line in chunks like he had over several seasons. Certainly, all paths must have crossed our pinch point at Junction Pass. The Muir Trail goes through there after all, so Bartholomew and Robinson and McCoy did. The red line comes damn close, too, which puts us in the path of Bard, Carter, and Cox, and now these new redliners. Great gear and good snow with a predictable corn cycle may grow interest again in Sierra touring, but there is something else still missing. The evangelists are gone. In the late 80s, not only were Carter and Bard writing articles, but they were a traveling circus, doing 8 to 10 slideshows each summer promoting the wild possibilities of skiing in the Sierra. It wasn't like we jumped in the river and did handsprings down the aisle, Carter recalls, but that was our goal. Dave Beck used to call us Pete and Repeat, he laughs. We were just verbal, and that was one of the things Alan and I shared. We could just ramble and invent schemes and go and laugh, really laugh. And that's why he's loved and remembered, right? Because he was a person who could bring somebody out of themselves. Bard, who was literally on track to become a preacher before discovering the mountains, really did want to show people the promised land. We knew when people were wiping their eyes, we'd touch them, Carter says. There's a long pause and his voice trembles. And it wasn't sadness. They just knew that there was some powerful stuff out there, and we were trying to introduce them to it. And it was fun to do that. The last line in the Redline article really sums up that relationship with the mountains and with each other. Joy ran like a current, between us. And it was there. And it was there, really from the beginning. And it wasn't really about a route at all. It was about a way.
This episode was brought to you by Minus 33. Stay comfortable with 100% merino wool. Go to minus33.com, that's minus33.com, and use code 33backcountry15 at checkout for 15% off today. The Backcountry Podcast is produced by Backcountry Magazine, an imprint of Height of Land Publications in Jeffersonville, Vermont. Betsy Monero is our managing editor. Our music was composed by Alex Paul. Bob Rusnock of Blue Stream Voice and Imaging is our engineer. Additional thanks to Tyler Cohen, Tom Hallberg, Mike Lorenz, Robin Earl, Paul Davis, Justin Ryer, Michelle Peoples, Holly Howard, and Karen Heward. At Backcountry Magazine, our small staff works hard to bring you stories that are thoughtfully edited, beautifully produced, and thoroughly fact-checked. Please consider supporting our independent journalism with a subscription to the magazine. You can subscribe or check out other swag at our website, backcountrymagazine.com. Use the code PODCAST for 10% off your entire order. I'm Adam Howard. Until next time, I'll see you in the hills. Thanks for listening.